Welcome to this presentation. I want to show you how clear-cutting has pushed us past the global tipping points on biodiversity loss and climate change, and demonstrate how switching to ecoforestry can repair the damage. Ultimately, it's a practical guide for how we can heal the relationship between humans and forests. My daughter Rihanna sparked its creation by texting me from an oceanography lecture. Dad, 40% of my class are crying today because we can't handle the information we're being given. I'd like you to think about that for a moment. The United Nations scientists are telling her that we're killing a species every half an hour, which will cause organized human life to be untenable in her lifetime. She kept moving forward, though, and has become a restoration ecologist. What kind of courage must it take for a young person to respond to their world on fire by calmly and patiently studying how moss can rehabilitate soil? So I'd like to dedicate this to her generation, to all the generations following, and especially to all the forest creatures and the tall standing ones, the trees, who have no voice. Thank you for coming out to protect your watershed. We know the best way to protect watersheds is to protect mature forests, and we know the only way to protect mature forests is to stop clear-cutting them. Here is the technical blueprint of how to practice 100% canopy and biomass retention forestry, which will protect a fifth of BC by regrowing it from degraded plantations back to mature forests, so they can go back to protecting us from extreme fires and floods. It will halt biodiversity loss and slow global warming by verifiable and measurable amounts. This is the new forestry paradigm, which will lock in 60 million cubic meters of premium lumber a year forever, and rebuild 50,000 truly sustainable forestry jobs that we can be proud to hand down to our children. We'll heal our divided communities and learn to live in harmony with all creation. This is the Menominee River. It flows through the reserve of the Menominee tribe in Wisconsin. They've been drinking this water, swimming and fishing in it since time immemorial. The water is clean and pure, and the river never floods. They don't have extreme fires because their forest holds 20 times the moisture that ours does. They're not in debt. They have all the jobs they want. They don't sell raw logs. They add value to all their wood. The Menominee own all their own sawmills and manufacturing facilities, which provide the bulk of their tribal income. They set their own price for their wood products, and people pay it because that quality isn't available anywhere else. They recently enshrined in law the same rights for their river as a person. Imagine protecting land by affirming its rights. The heart of the protection they offer their forest is their dependence on it for their livelihood. Indigenous ecologist Robin Wall-Kimmerer calls this a reciprocal relationship of give and take. They take individual trees, but in return they protect the canopy and structural integrity of their forest. By protecting their forest, they protect their watershed. The new forestry paradigm isn't new to them. They've been doing it for 140 years. And since 1890, from just 90,000 hectares of forest, they've removed billions of board feet of premier lumber. How did they do it? They simply never, ever clear-cut their forest. This picture you're looking at is Merv Wilkinson's Wildwood Ecoforest in Ladysmith, BC. Since 1938, he took 1 million board feet from 56 hectares, and there's more lumber available now than when he started. He carefully measured the annual growth, and he always cut less. He called it living off the interest. When Merv took the single tree out, the surrounding trees grew faster on the added sunlight and soil resources they got. He didn't degrade the soil or destroy surrounding biomass. He always maintained a range of species and age. A BC Forest Service study confirmed he would continue to get 3 cubic meters per hectare of high-quality lumber forever. By switching to 100% biomass and canopy protection forestry, 3 cubic meters per hectare from our 20 million hectare timber harvest land base would give us 60 million hectares of lumber a year, more than we get now. We'd get that annual yield immediately, because instead of clear-cutting 1% and waiting 80 years to come back, we'd be gently harvesting the entire timber harvest land base. And look at the lumber we'd get. In contrast, look at what clear-cutting does to a forest. Clear-cutting exposes the topsoil to be incinerated by the sun and wash away in the rain, which runs off and kills salmon trying to spawn and floods our rivers. Notice how the trees in the background are holding rain and mist, and the foreground is not. How much carbon dioxide is this land sequestering? How much biodiversity is it sheltering? How much water can it hold? How fast will it burn? In clear-cutting, roads are permanent scars on the land. but not in ecoforestry. This picture shows you how MIRV's mainline logging road running right through the middle of a family of trees without disturbing them. You can prove ecoforestry to yourself by going to Wildwood and wandering through the groves of 500-year-old trees. You can see the 1,200-year-old Douglas fir and how healthy MIRV cedars are even in the current droughts. I call it ecoforestry for short, but in scientific terms, this forestry is defined as 100% biomass and canopy preservation forestry. Because if you don't have the canopy, you don't have a forest. And if you're reducing the average annual biomass, you're degrading the land. I've updated MIRV's math a little, but it boils down to restricting harvesting to 1 tree per hectare per year. MIRV was awarded the Order of Canada for Wildwood. Before he passed away, he said, "I'm most proud of the fact that I've been able to demonstrate against opposition from industry and government that you don't have to kill the world to have timber." I lived at Wildwood for 18 months to absorb the legacy of MIRV's work, but my journey to become a forestry ecologist started in 1979 when I joined a guild of woodcarvers to make public sculpture. We brought this tree to Toronto and carved it in a park, where it's now a beloved part of a community. In a film of the project, in the scene after we cut the tree, the camera quietly caught me standing with my hands softly on the tree bark, saying, "Thank you." Imagine a teenager from Toronto thanking a tree. It was decades before I learned to see individual trees as members of a forest community, but I was learning to protect forests by celebrating them. I was developing a relationship with the land. Here is ecoforestry as I learned it. We couldn't buy the kind of lumber we wanted, so we go into a forest, fall a tree, slice it up, and trade the homeowner half the wood for our labor. You can see in the picture how little disturbance this creates in the forest, just like MIRV's harvesting at Wildwood or the Menominee in Wisconsin. This is single tree selective harvesting. All the sawdust falls back to the forest floor to become soil. We can use far more advanced technology, but this photograph captures the heart of how we can change the relationship between humans and forests from exploitive to protective. In 20 minutes, you'll know how you can change your relationship with your forest. But to better outline the solutions, let me quickly show you where the old forestry paradigm. The first mistake our forest industry and government made was to think they can manage forest ecosystems as natural resources. I recently heard Dr. David Suzuki say, "Anyone who thinks they can manage an ecosystem is insane." I have designed 100% biomass and canopy retention forestry, not to manage the forest, but to manage the humans. The forests that Indigenous land guardian Angela Davidson sees as family, industry sees as fiber. The Canadian forest industry rakes in $1 billion a week, which buys a lot of influence, leading citizens to lament corporate capture of our government. The province's tenure legislation assigns half our trees to just 5 billionaire corporations for 5 cents a board foot, which consumers will pay $5 a board foot for. Forest policy is designed for corporations to increase quarterly profit by slashing labor costs and pushing ecological costs off onto our grandchildren. In 2015, they dissolved the Forest Service. So now the corporations supervise themselves and write their own forestry prescriptions. And what is that prescription? Clear cutting. Our governments and industry say clear cutting isn't deforestation, which is defined as permanent land use change from forest to something else, even though clear cutting degrades mature forest into something else, an immature plantation. The global consensus of scientists working through the United Nations call clear cutting permanent forest loss and land degradation. They evaluate the overall severity of land degradation by counting social, economic, and ecological factors. Let's look at the economics first. The Truck Loggers Association are leading experts in timberland value, and they contend that clear cutting degrades land value per hectare from approximately $1 million a hectare to $100,000. The tree images are to scale, and they tell us why. Mature forests produce 3 times as much lumber per hectare, and the wood is worth at least 3 times as much. Clear cutting is economic land degradation to the tune of 90%. Our timber harvest land base is 20 million hectares. That means in just 60 years, we've allowed corporations to asset strip the value of BC forests from $20 trillion down to just $2 trillion. To disguise this asset stripping, they coined the term sustainable yield forestry. They hoped to confuse the public into thinking they were practicing sustainable forestry. Sustainable forestry sustains the ecological integrity of ecosystems. Sustained yield forestry only sustains the annual yield of fiber. But it doesn't even do that. Every decade, as they exhausted the premium old growth and moved into the interior and started cutting more and more second growth, they've been cutting more hectares just to get the same fiber. This means trouble for the forests that protect our watersheds, because to keep the fiber and jobs flowing as land productivity drops, we've had to cut more and more total hectares per year. How many more? Triple, but our government didn't want to face that music, so they kept on counting the allowable annual cut in cubic meters of fiber, not hectares of land degraded. Cutting 70,000 hectares a year was bad, but cutting 250,000 hectares a year is Nanaimo every 2 weeks, Greater Vancouver every year. We're not out of trees because of pine beetles or fires. We're scraping the barrel because clear-cutting is a horribly inefficient way of growing trees. Now that we're clear-cutting Vancouver Island every 20 years, public backlash has led to empty promises to protect the last 3% of productive old growth and develop a new forestry paradigm. Unfortunately, governments don't do paradigm shifts. They do studies and announcements. So here's their plan so far. The first wave of the government's new forestry paradigm was leaving a few trees behind in each clear-cut. They call this shelterwood logging. Because there are no measurable ecological benefits to the land, forestry scientists call this leaving a few trees behind in a clear-cut. And because they only count the AAC in fiber, not land, for every 800 trees they leave behind in clear-cuts, they need to go clear-cut another hectare just to make up the AAC. Shelterwood logging just increases total annual land degradation. The public have not been fooled, so government and industry have pressed on to partial cutting. These are photos from a series of studies started after the Clayoquot protests. They are doing a lot of good science about ecological degradation in clear-cuts, but unfortunately not measuring it at watershed level, and they're using the ecosystem services of the surrounding forest to offset the degradation in the clear-cut. International science has denounced offsetting because the surrounding trees are already providing those ecosystem services. Offsetting is how our governments claim that clear-cutting is carbon neutral, when clear-cutting actually causes more carbon emissions in BC than fossil fuels. Partial cutting is just clear-cutting smaller blocks because it ignores the elephant in the room, which is, when are you coming back? In the real world, they come back to cut the adjacent trees. We've been partial cutting all along. The white areas in this picture are the current partial cut, this part here. And the lighter green areas, over here, are the adjacent 10-year-old partial cuts. In the 1960s, the Forest Service used to restrict partial cutting of watersheds to cut 30%, wait 10 years. Cut another 30%, wait another 10 years. Then cut the last 30%. That meant that 90% of a watershed could be cut in 30 years. And when you come back to start all over again, which is called the period of rotation, the trees could be as little as 40 years old. Whether you cut big blocks or small blocks, or return sooner or later, clear-cutting is still permanent land degradation. And with no Forest Service left to place any limitations, now our watersheds are being clear-cut to ribbons. The next slide shows the ecological consequences. This picture illustrates the cumulative effects of clear-cutting 250,000 hectares a year. The dark green is forest land. The light green are recent partial clear-cuts. The white patches are partial clear-cuts that are so fresh they haven't even greened up. Dr. Yunus Alila's peer-reviewed research tells us that clear-cutting just 11% of a watershed at once can double flood incidence and increase severity. These clear-cuts vastly exceed the 11% threshold. This is typical all over BC, but these are the watersheds above Merritt, BC. It was not an atmospheric river that caused the floods in Merritt. Back in Merritt's Great Storm of 2007, when a previous atmospheric river dumped even more rain around Merritt, over 2 days, there was no flooding. The 2007 storm was a natural, beneficial process of recharging the aquifer because there was enough forest biomass to provide the ecosystem service of holding enough of the water on the land. The atmospheric river in 2021 caused catastrophic flooding because 15 years of hyper-accelerated clear-cutting stripped off too much living biomass and pushed the watersheds upstream from Merritt beyond their tipping points. The third horrible mistake was never sparing a thought for the trillions of living beings they kill every single hectare, every single year. Because the stumpage fees are a flat rate that only applies to wood that goes in the truck, clearcutters leave 80% of the biomass they kill in the bush to be burned in slash piles or forest fires. Because they don't have a relationship with the land, they don't measure the impact on the hectares they're degrading. For instance, every year in BC, clearcutting destroys 400,000 migratory bird nests and up to 300,000 pregnant or brooding female birds. Biodiversity loss is usually overlooked, but it's extremely important because the United Nations scientists list biodiversity loss as one of the two main driving factors, leading to planetary ecological collapse. The greatest global driver of species extinction is loss of mature forest, which has led to BC being labeled as a global extirpation hotspot. The plight of the marbled murrelet illustrates why. Murrelets are only adapted to nesting in huge clumps of moss that take 100 years to accumulate, and don't even start growing until a tree is 100 years old. No mature trees, no nests. No nests, no murrelet. Deep snow mountain caribou are another endangered species that require old growth because in winter their crucial food source is pawing in the snow for huge clumps of dislodged lichen that take decades to grow and only grow on old trees. For caribou, a clearcut is not only a foodless wasteland, it's also a killing ground where wolves can spot them easily. But killing wolves will not save the caribou from extinction because caribou also need those ancient trees to exist in large ranges. It's fragmentation of habitat by clearcutting that is ultimately driving the deep snow mountain caribou to extinction. Protecting tiny postage stamps of old growth scattered around a province can never provide enough contiguous habitat to support viable caribou populations. We face a similar problem with many species, including spotted owls and northern goshawks. The only way to save them is to re-stitch the 19 million hectares of postage stamps in the timber harvest land base back into a huge biodiversity sanctuary. The only way to do that is to stop clearcutting. By transforming our clearcuts and plantations back into biodiversity habitat, switching to ecoforestry would protect 20% of BC at the stroke of a pen. But would the international forest science community really call it protection? I believe they would. This next slide offers my proof. The only way to scientifically assess the ecological impact of forestry is to measure the annual retention of living biomass. Because biomass is what provides ecosystem services like sheltering biodiversity, sequestering carbon, creating topsoil, and holding water on the landscape. We need to count it because the more total biomass we have, the more ecosystem services we get. The more timber biomass we have, the more money and jobs we get. This chart compares biomass retention per hectare between column A, ecoforestry, and column B, clearcutting, and quantifies the difference in the three columns over here on the left. The green column is total cubic meters of living biomass. An average hectare of mature temperate rainforest will have 3,500 cubic meters of living biomass on it. That's the most of any biome in the entire world. Because trees are nearly half water and half carbon, 1,400 tons will be carbon, shown in the middle column, and 1,500 cubic meters will be water, shown far left. The living biomass is divided into the light green other biomass on top, including bark, branches, and foliage, the dark green timber biomass in the middle, which is marketable trunk wood, and the brown soil biomass, which includes litter, roots, and all the life below ground. These numbers are readily available from the Truck Loggers Association and the Canadian government's National Forest Inventory software, and the work of UBC forestry ecologist Dr. Cindy Prescott. But nobody's ever put them together in this way. I created this chart because to assess sustainability, we must consider the retention of average annual biomass on a site over time. The gray strip across the top here divides the chart into 320-year sections in 20-year segments. Scenario A is 120 years of ecoforestry, such as Merv practiced at Wildwood. Every 20 years, the little vertical red lines here represent a single tree selective harvest of 60 cubic meters. Then you wait 20 years for it to grow back, and then you cut again. Then you wait 20 years for it to grow back, and then you cut again, and you wait another 20 years, and you cut it again, and so on. You can literally practice this forestry forever. and still retain 100% of the living biomass. In a wilderness mature forest, this happens naturally as trees die every year and the openings help seedlings reach for the sky. Biologically speaking, the main difference between a wilderness forest and an ecoforest is we're choosing which trees we want and we're putting the trunks on a truck. After 120 years of sustainable ecoforestry, scenario B starts with this clear cut here. The thick red line where virtually all the living biomass is killed. The clear cuts continue in 60-year cycles. When the forest industry says it grows back, they're implying that it all grows back. This chart counts how little grows back, measured in the percentage of original biomass in this column on the far right. On average, clear cutting drops the living biomass per hectare from 3,500 cubic meters to 350 cubic meters forever. Clear cutting only leaves an average of 10% of the original biomass. I got the regrowth rates for this site indexed from the BC government and checked them against figures from the University of Oregon. We can use the chart to calculate many reductions in ecosystem services, such as that land degraded into a clear-cut plantation cycle will only absorb 10% of the carbon and water that mature forests do. But the chart doesn't show reductions in site biodiversity and the degraded resilience to pests, disease, and drought, which is driven by damage to the soil. Trees will grow back fairly quickly, but degraded soil loss takes literally thousands of years to fully recover. This is what permanent biomass of 90% looks like in soil. The soil on the left was photographed in an old-growth forest during a workshop I did to establish an ecoforest in the Kootenays. It was as soft and moist as you see it on the hottest day to that point in human history. The soil on the right is from land that was first clear-cut 100 years ago, which has failed to regenerate. If this is what happens to temperate rainforest soil, imagine what the damage is in a fragile ecosystem. Soil is the foundation of all terrestrial life, so we need to reverse this process, which is why 100% biomass and canopy retention forestry focuses on soil regeneration. My daughter, the restoration ecologist, described 90% biomass loss as follows. 90% biomass loss means owls unable to nest, no standing deadwood to provide woodpeckers with insects, no understory plants catching sunlight, silence where there used to be birdsong, 100-year-old lichens being crushed in the mud, no forage to support caribou habitat, broken underground communication networks between tree communities, no banana slugs on moist fallen logs, no young hemlocks waiting in the shade for an opening, not enough moisture for even moss to recover. I chose temperate rainforest to model because this is the old growth that society is fighting over right now, and I wanted to fully document the scale of our loss. I also wanted to calculate just how much we can get back. When I did this chart for the drier, less productive forests in the interior, I found that the 90% biomass reduction is a mathematical constant. Although more fragile ecosystems start with less biomass, their growth rate is much lower, and the ratio of loss gets worse in more fragile ecosystems. I will be publishing this chart in Nature magazine as proof that clear-cutting is severe land degradation, that scientifically constitutes forest loss. It shows us what clear-cutting does to 1 hectare, but it also allows us to calculate the cumulative effects of degrading land permanently by multiplying the effects on 1 hectare over the total area degraded. This is a map of BC where unforested areas and mountains are shown in white, and the 2 shades of green show our remaining uncut primary forests that the public call old growth. The red area includes 5 million hectares of deforestation lost to agricultural land, cities, and roads. It also includes 20 million hectares of severe land degradation of the timber harvest land base. Clear-cutting has stripped 90% of the biomass from a quarter of BC's entire land base. The map also highlights the fragmentation of biodiversity habitat caused. The only way to assemble enough contiguous habitat for wide-ranging biodiversity is engaging the paradigm shift of growing the entire timber harvest land base back to maturity. When you take 3,200 cubic meters of lost biomass per hectare and you multiply it by 25 million hectares, that comes to 80 cubic kilometers of living biomass. Imagine losing a giant sponge 9 kilometers wide by 9 kilometers wide, by 1 kilometer high. That's 3 times the volume of Lake Okanagan. My calculation doesn't even count the other biomass per hectare of deciduous shrubs, moss, and lichen. While it might be a bit high for the interior and boreal forests, it's low for the temperate rainforest that we cut first to make Vancouver. Whether the total is 50 cubic kilometers or 100 cubic kilometers, it's embarrassing that a private citizen should be the first to count them. Our governments should have produced these numbers in 1950, before they started industrial clear cutting. By the time this chart gets to Nature magazine, more qualified people than me will have these numbers better. But we can use the biomass retention chart to estimate the cumulative loss of ecosystem services from clear cutting in BC. Well, we've lost $18 trillion of lumber and biomass that was comprised of 25 billion tons of carbon and 27 cubic kilometers of water. We've lost a further 100 cubic kilometers of water from the aquifers and landscape because biomass absorbs 2 to 8 times its weight in water. So we've lost the capacity of that 80 cubic kilometer sponge to absorb storms and atmospheric rivers. When Unisalila was first studying hydrology, he was told that clear cutting only affected smaller watersheds. Big watersheds were simply too big to fail. Our governments have proven that claim wrong. Their reckless experiment of permanently removing a 40 cubic kilometer sponge of living biomass from the Fraser River watershed caused the flood in Abbotsford. When the floods came, the government had just prepared a watershed study. Realizing that it failed to include floods, they quickly added a flood study. Neither study mentioned clear cutting once. These studies will never produce any legislation that will protect us from extreme flooding because they aren't even aware of the scale of the land degradation of BC's watersheds. We face the same problem of fires because permanently removing 80 cubic kilometers of living biomass from BC has drained our aquifers, desiccated our province, and turned it into a tinderbox. We don't just have more fires or more hectares burnt in fires. We're facing a drastic rise in total fire severity and carbon emissions. Instead of just burning leaves and small branches and tarring the bark, modern extreme fires kill more trees, and they burn so hot they completely vaporize entire trees. We can measure the total effects of fire severity by counting the total CO2 emissions from fires, because each ton of carbon dioxide emitted represents a ton of biomass completely converted from wood to smoke. Part of the reason the fires burn hotter is that global warming has heated up and dried out the landscape. The logging industry likes to blame the fires on global warming because global warming shifts the responsibility far away. But who caused this global warming? It turns out that clear cutting is the number 2 cause of global warming because killing trees stops them from sequestering carbon. In BC, because we have so many forests and cut them so hard, clear cutting is the number 1 cause of global warming, more than fossil fuel emissions. To assess the cumulative effects of clear cutting on wildfires, I've plotted the annual increase in fire severity against the cumulative loss of forest biomass in BC over time. The green area on the chart is our shrinking mature forest in the timber harvest land base, which was our 80 cubic kilometer sponge. The black area is our growing area of degraded land, which no longer provides 90% of the ecosystem services it used to. Fire severity in BC has increased directly with the increase in degraded land, and inversely with retained biomass. We quietly passed a tipping point in 1990, and the fires have gotten worse as we dried out our landscape by clear cutting. Having a fire threaten your community is devastating, but from the land's perspective, despite the increase in severity, wildfires are still only responsible for 15% of temperate forest loss, and this loss is temporary because burned forests recover over time. Meanwhile, clear cutting is responsible for 75% of global temperate forest loss, and this forest loss is permanent because the land is degraded by 90% forever. In BC, as with floods and biodiversity loss, our government is accelerating the problem by ignoring the cause. None of the studies or announcements have ever mentioned clear cutting once. The debates around salvage logging and proper fire protection are not grounded in forest science, and they prescribe chainsaw medicine to solve the problem that clear cutting created. The only way to deal with floods and fires is a paradigm shift. Mature forests don't burn like plantations and clear cuts do. They also protect us from floods. The only way we can protect ourselves is to protect mature forests. As internationally respected forest scientist Dr. Suzanne Simard said in her recent bestseller, Finding the Mother Tree, this isn't about us saving the trees, it's about them saving us. I like to think it's a two-way street. I was asking my ecologist daughter how she was doing with her world on fire the other day, and she texted me back. The Anthropocene was quite a party, but everyone's tired now and they just want to go home. Luckily, the roadmap of how we got into this mess also shows us the road home. John W. Reed, author of Saving Big Forests to Save the Planet, says we must protect our intact forests and bring back those that we have lost. John's from California, where Los Angeles and the Great Valley are lost forever to urbanization and agriculture. BC is different. We're unique in all the world in that we not only still have 1 million at-risk hectares of old growth we can protect, but also another 19 million hectares in our timber harvest land base that we can grow back to maturity. Our timber harvest land base is bigger than England. It's all crown land with no cities or farms in it. We don't have to buy it back from anyone. Our government could grow a forest area bigger than England back to maturity by simply passing legislation banning clear cutting. Here's how it would work. To access the maximum ecosystem services, we need to maintain maximum living biomass. To grow the most biomass, first we need to retain the canopy, and then we simply restrict our annual cut to less than our annual growth, measured in watersheds, on each hectare. No partial cutting shell games. Every hectare done right. What's quite wonderful is that the more biomass we grow, the more lumber we get to put back in the truck. But more biomass doesn't automatically mean better quality lumber. To restore the full economic land value back, we need to pay very careful attention to 3 things. The driving key factor is trunk diameter. 24 inches is minimum, but we want 36 diameter and up. To get that diameter, we have to increase the spacing between the trees and the age to which they are allowed to grow. Depending on your ecosystem and local species, your actual values may change slightly. But the guiding principle is to design our forestry, not to increase corporate profits by reducing labor costs, but to produce the best quality lumber we can. In BC, 100% biomass and canopy retention forestry is designed to produce 36-inch diameter trees at harvest. Here's why. This is how sawmills look at trees. Everything about larger trees is better for jobs and income. 50% less waste factor, less handling, bigger, better boards, high-end options like beams, quarter-sawn lumber, and live edge lumber. When your community forest is adjusting your business plan for higher income and adding value, this is where it begins. Every forester who goes out to do a day's work in the forest should look at this chart on their way out the door. Before the main slideshow about canopy and spacing and harvesting, I'd like to show you a short slideshow on the best way to grow trees for optimal lumber. Everything about 100% biomass and canopy retention forestry is based on observing how forests work. If we want to harvest 36-inch diameter trees, we must respect that forests have evolved over 300 million years to not grow into each other. We call this crown shyness or intercrown spacing. Dr. Simard highlights how trees moderate their competition as individuals with collaboration for community best interests. The trees on the left have a 5-meter crown and root diameter, which is the maximum they can grow in 5-meter spacing. The trees on the right have a 2.5-meter crown and root diameter at 2.5-meter spacing. All my charts are to scale. Notice how much bigger the trunk diameter is on the 5-meter trees on the left. I planted 300,000 trees in the 1980s at 2.5-meter spacing. Trees planted 2.5 meters apart can only grow a trunk of about 12-inch diameter because they're limited by their root system's ability to gather water and nutrients, and they can't make enough needles to gather enough energy to grow bigger. These trees are 100 years old, but there are very few that are even 12-inch diameter. The sweet spot for optimal biomass production and quality lumber growth is between 5 and 6 meters. In practice, when out in the bush, we don't chase our foresters around with a tape measure. We let them use a range from 4 meters to 7 meters depending on terrain, surrounding trees, rocky outcrops, etc. The ideal spacing is between 5 and 6 meters, but for demonstration of concept, I've just chosen an average 5-meter spacing, which yields 40-inch diameter trunks and 400 trees per hectare. The other key factor is, of course, time. Now that the old growth is gone, we need to set ourselves up with a forestry system that affords time for trees to achieve the trunk diameter we want. To explain why tree diameter, spacing, and time are so important, let me show you this slideshow I produced to show how to rehabilitate fresh clear cuts, like I'm doing with the Eastern Sun Forest Sanctuary in the Kootenays. It starts with a fresh clear cut, which has just been planted with seedlings on 2.5 meter spacing. In 10 years, they'll be about 10 feet high, but won't have formed enough canopy to protect the soil, so leave them for now to help rebuild biomass, stabilize soil structure, and hold snow and rain on the landscape. 20 years old is the perfect time to space the trees, when they're still small enough to handle easily, but are tall enough to outcompete any deciduous. If we wait too long after 20 years, they won't fatten their trunks and fill out their crown diameter to form a proper canopy. They'll waste energy reaching for the sky to beat their neighbors. Spacing is performed by removing anything under 4 meter spacing, which in this diagram is every second tree. If you can't sell the trees, chop them up into pieces small enough to scatter around so they'll lay flat in the ground, where they'll get wet and begin to turn into soil. If you have too much material to lay flat, or you're in a hurry, use a chipper. With the soil degraded 90%, it needs every bit of biomass we can give it. Soil restoration is the central pillar of ecoforestry. Any biomass that hits the ground becomes soil, and we measure the increase over time. If dead biomass is 2 or 3 feet above the ground, it can dry out and become fuel. To convert potential fuel into soil, simply chop the material until it hits the forest floor, or chip it if it's too branchy and small or faced with material piling up. We'll call this chop and chip. Please note, spacing is not thinning. Thinning is a completely unscientific concept which can mean anything. In North America, the results of thinning, sometimes done in the name of fire suppression, are usually an ecological nightmare. Spacing ensures that the canopy is retained and is carried out to strict boundaries, such as 5 to 6 meters, to maximize lumber production. Spacing includes filling any gaps by planting trees. What you have left are all lumber trees. So begin the pruning process by cutting the lower branches back right to the bark with a sharp saw. Generally, I don't like to remove more than 15% or a third of the height of a tree's foliage in one shot, but the first prunes sometimes exceed this because the first 6 feet of removing fire ladders is so crucial, and because once a lower branch stops getting enough sunlight to justify the expense of maintaining it, it becomes a liability for the tree. As trees abandon these branches, the natural process of them dying and dropping off takes decades, which exposes trees to infiltration from harmful fungi and insects. Chop and chip the branches for soil. After spacing and pruning, echo natural succession by planting a deciduous shrub at the 2.5 meter spacing between the trees. Deciduous are nature's answers to any disturbance. They rush in like emergency paramedics, shade and stabilize the soil, and shower it with dead leaves every fall. Salal is my favorite deciduous because in a sunny spot like this, it will grow quickly to 2 meters high and wide. But 20 years later, as an understory plant, it gracefully fades back to the size it can maintain with whatever sunlight it gets. Planting deciduous is also fire smarting because deciduous shrubs hold a lot of water. Choose your deciduous with a local biologist and always maximize biodiversity. At 40 years old, your trees will have created enough canopy to start holding rain and snow from washing off the land. Although the ability of each hectare to hold water and sequester carbon is still reduced 80% from a mature forest, the worst is over and you're on the road home. Keep cruising the land every 10 years to record inventory and continue pruning, so your prime lumber sections will be 80% clear. Tree pruning is vastly underrated. An hour's work can pay you back $5,000. It makes your land worth 3 times as much and protects you from fires. It gives tons of wood chips per hectare to accelerate soil rebuilding. It's the most important in the first 80 years, while trunk diameter is still small. Once the trees are 40 years old, start to take 1 tree per hectare per year and immediately planting the replacement. This starts to create income to help pay for the pruning, initiates the process of modifying your even age stand into a full age range, and reintroduce biodiversity. Keep making passes through every 10 years to take 10 trees per hectare and prune the trees up a bit more. These 80-year-old trees are what the clear-cut cycle was originally intended to produce. But millions of hectares were never restocked properly, much less spaced, because the corporate tenure legislation and the devolution of government oversight didn't work. Pruning never entered their minds. From the perspective of our little red person, these trees look pretty big, but as you'll see in a moment, they're ridiculously small. I have added this slide to the 40-year interval because extending the rotation up to 100 years is what many progressive foresters are doing to try and be more sustainable than a 40 to 80-year-old rotation. It is also what you get when you only cut 1%, because every 100 years will be back where you started to go round again. 100-year-old trees are better than 80-year-old trees, and waiting 100 years instead of 80 years is better for the land. But how much better? Let's see. Here's a 60-year rotation. It reduces the biomass 90%. The land is permanently degraded. It never recovers. 60 years is about average now in BC. Here is a 100-year rotation, or cutting 1%. It reduces biomass by 85%. The land never recovers. Habitat for biodiversity is not supported. Timber value never recovers. Resistance to pest, disease, fire, and drought are never restored. Clear-cutting 1% and extending the rotation are only a minor adjustment to the old paradigm. They do not break the cycle of forest loss. The only road home is 100% biomass and canopy retention forestry. You will notice that the size of the harvest cuts in ecoforestry restoration, here in column B, are almost the same size as the cuts in column A, the mature forest. That's because your trees are spaced properly at 5 to 6 meters, and as you take your single tree selective cuts at 1 tree per hectare per year, you're releasing the surrounding trees to grow faster. Your spacing pass will also accelerate growth per hectare, while it puts a huge volume of lumber on the truck. The lumber quality will still be as low as clear cutting provided at the beginning, but at least it will be improved with every year that passes. The biggest factor in annual lumber yield is that instead of clear cutting just 1% of land per year and waiting 100 years to come back, you'll be gently active on all your land at once. As Merv Wilkinson used to say, your land is never out of production. Cutting a tree at 100 years is a tragedy, because trees only begin to produce lumber efficiently between 125 and 200 years old. The best way to visualize this is to think about the volume of tree rings. At 40 years, an 8-inch tree puts on a 25-inch circumference ring, about a 1/16 of an inch thick, 40 feet tall. At 120 years, a 16-inch diameter tree puts on a 50-inch circumference ring, twice as thick and 100 feet tall. It's about 5 times the lumber. That lumber is also 50% carbon, which is why we need to let forests grow to maturity, because a 120-year-old tree captures 5 times the carbon a 40-year-old tree does. To the little red person in the picture, these trees look big too, but they're just starting to grow. Let's watch. Keep your eyes focused on trunk diameter. That's more like it. Here is a 200-year-old tree beside a 100-year-old tree. Which one would you prefer? Clear cutting was designed by corporations to increase quarterly profit by slashing labor costs and pushing ecological impacts off onto our children. 100% biomass and canopy retention forestry was designed to maximize the ecological, social, and economic value of the land and heal the relationship between humans and forests. Now we get to the main slideshow, which will show how ecoforestry protects the forest ecosystem and your watershed by restoring canopy, biodiversity, and all the lost biomass. Here is the blueprint for the new forestry paradigm. This chart we'll use for our slideshow blueprint is 1 hectare of land, 80 meters by 125 meters in 20-meter increments. Everything is to scale. It has a small creek in the middle and 2 small skidder roads like Merv's. The first 4 steps to convert your land to an ecoforest are cruising, spacing, creating habitat, and keeper trees. Costs are reduced by doing all 4 in one pass, which transform your staff from loggers or specialists into well-rounded foresters. When you convert to 100% biomass and canopy retention forestry, the first thing you do is cruise the land and record your inventory, including your lumber trees, deciduous trees and shrubs, soil biomass, and biodiversity. This baseline data establishes a foundation upon which you can verifiably measure increases in ecosystem services provided each decade, so you can eco-brand and market your wood and attract carbon and biodiversity funding. Maximizing site biodiversity requires maintaining 30 to 40 dead standing habitat trees per hectare. Dead trees smaller than 50 centimeters in diameter are not big enough, and you can chop and chip them to accelerate soil reclamation if you feel they're a fire hazard. The dead fallen category, number 9 here, is counted along with litter as soil. Here's a close-up to show you the habitat trees in between our lumber trees on 5-meter spacing. As with restoring your other biodiversity, create your habitat trees under the guidance of a biologist to comprise a range of species, size, and decomposition level natural to your ecosystem. Do this while you're spacing. If you don't have enough naturally, you can create habitat trees by killing extra trees not on 5-meter spacing, or even some that are, by girdling them. You can even use a small chainsaw to dig out cavities and make little hotels for birds and mammals. When you begin practicing ecoforestry, you'll often find that the spacing is too tight to grow maximum lumber efficiently. I've shown the trees at less than 4-meter spacing here in red, because these trees are often a fire hazard. As you cruise the land, identify your chosen lumber trees from a minimum of 4 meters to a maximum of 7 meters. If you find an 8-meter or bigger space, immediately plant a tree in it. Any trees less than the 4-meter spacing, not assigned as dead standing habitat, can immediately be spaced so that they won't compete with their neighbors, resulting in 2 skinny trees where 1 big fat tree would have grown. Voila, a properly spaced forest at our sweet spot for lumber and biomass production, 5 to 6 meters. After cruising, spacing, and habitat tree creation, now you have a forest structure that will restore your forest back to maturity with the full range of species and biodiversity as the original primary forest, and maintain it forever. Restricting harvest to 1 tree per hectare per year from 400 trees creates an extremely flexible and robust ecosystem and lumber pool. So if you experience mortality events or make a few mistakes counting and falling trees, you have lots of extra trees to guarantee you'll always be increasing your biomass and harvesting at least 200-year-old trees. I added this slide as an alternative for those concerned with crown fires, showing the minimum trees per hectare you can still harvest 200-year-old trees at using a harvest rate of 1 tree per hectare per year, which you can achieve through averaging 6-meter spacing. Remember though, by far and away our best protection from extreme floods and fires is to grow all our clearcuts and plantations back to maturity. Once you have a mature forest, the finer details of tree spacing are mostly about getting the most efficient growing pattern to achieve optimum lumber volume and quantity. Let's return to our 5-meter forest with 400 trees per hectare. If any of your lumber trees die, count them and include them in your next cut. If an adverse event kills 20 trees, take them all. Just wait 20 years to come back. Even if you lose 300 lumber trees a hectare to beetle kill or a fire, just leave your 40 dead standing habitat trees and put the rest on a truck. If they aren't viable as lumber, chop and chip them for soil. Ecoforestry promotes tree resilience by providing them with more resources, but your forest will still experience pests and disease, but less and less as restoration progresses. The next step of forestry preparation is unique to 100% biomass and canopy retention forestry, but it is the most important one of all. This is the secret ingredient that turns active forestry into scientifically verifiable protection of land. The fourth thing you do in your first cruise is identify 50 or more keeper trees. These will never be cut unless they die naturally, or in rare instances such as your community needs a tree to make a pole or a canoe. If you harvest a keeper tree, immediately designate an adjacent replacement. These keeper trees are shown as 6-meter canopy trees. Maintaining biodiversity is a key factor in protection of land, so 50 keeper trees is a minimum. If you want to prioritize biodiversity or other values further, you can identify up to 200 keeper trees and still have the minimum 200 lumber trees, depending on your ecosystem, tree spacing, and preferences. I turned the blue color down a bit on the keeper trees after this slide to avoid distraction. The keeper trees are chosen because they are perceived as superior genetic stock or cedar trees. They can also be added for biodiversity, for instance, non-lumber species like arbutus, yew, grand fir, etc. Keeper trees are vital habitat trees for animals that need old growth for nesting or food sources, such as marbled murrelets and deep snow mountain caribou. They're also important for cultural purposes, such as canoes or carvings to attract tourism. My favorite reason to keep keeper trees is just because. Alrighty then, let's begin. Here in year 0, we will cut 5 trees and wait 5 years to come back. The number of trees taken and the years passed is always the same. The number of hectares we measure always stays at 1, which protects the forest from the kind of shell games that partial cutting exploits. The red dots are trees we cut. As soon as you buck up their trunks, chop or chip the branches, and plant their replacements, which show up as the green dots. 5 years later, notice that the stumps from our last cut are now shown as little black circles, and the trees we planted have changed from green dots to small seedlings. This size of opening lets in the perfect amount of light to release the new seedling and promote extra growth in the adjacent trees, which accelerates the forest's overall biomass growth and carbon sequestration. Optimal opening size is a key factor on why the growth values on the biomass retention chart for ecoforestry restoration climb just as quickly as if there were no harvests. But is there an upper limit on opening size? Turns out there is. UBC soil scientist Dr. Cindy Prescott tells us that underground tree connectivity only extends 5 to 10 meters, so openings bigger than 10 meters between tree trunks create dead soil zones where biomass and ecosystem services are greatly reduced. By cutting our trees in lines, we guarantee our seedlings a maximum 5-meter distance to the next trunk. If we cut a second line, shown in yellow, this would leave a 15-meter gap between living trees, which would start to push the envelope. We would only do this for a good reason, such as safely removing trees from difficult terrain. A triple harvest line, shown here in red, would create a 25-meter gap between retained trees. At that point, you're just starting to clear-cut small blocks again. Openings bigger than 20 meters also punch too big a hole in the canopy, which impacts forest health. What you're seeing here is how big the degraded soil zone would be for a 1% clear cut, seen as a 10-year cycle cut of 10% of the trees. So, off we go somewhere else on our hectare with another 5-year, 5-tree cut in a line. These two roads, by the way, are 8-foot wide skidder roads like Merv used. I've left them more open here than I would in real life so you can see them more easily, but in real life they'd be under canopy. Ideally, your lines and roads should run across the land's contour lines to avoid erosion and parallel to nearby highways to minimize impacts on tourism. One of the bonuses of banning clearcutting and switching to ecoforestry is that we'd be able to pull premium lumber from 1 million hectares along our roads and around our cities and towns, which would finance fire smarting them. Immediate planting enables the seedlings to instantly connect with the mycorrhizal and root networks, who will be concerned to have just lost their living tree partners. Planting the same species will optimize network connection, but your priority must always be restoring species diversity back to original primary forest values under the guidance of your biologist. In clearcutting, tree planting is an expensive hassle, and much of our province is classed not sufficiently restocked. In ecoforestry, tree planting is a cheap and cheerful breeze because trees are replaced the same day they were cut into fully functioning forest soil, so they'll quickly outpace the adjacent deciduous shrubs. No fertilizer, glyphosate, or brushing will ever be required. I started the slideshow with 5-year cuts of 5 trees because that's what Merv did at Wildwood and what many homeowners choose to get on their land often. Ultimately, this cycle of return is up to you. It depends on how many hectares you have, how difficult it is to access them, and how many people you want to employ each year. If you're starting with a fresh clear cut, every 2 years is good. For a 5-year-old clear cut or beginning a new conversion of an older forest, a 5-year cycle gets you around your land quickly. If you're a community forest, though, and you're in the swing of things, 10 years is the most efficient cycle. A crew of 2 could get these trees onto a truck in a day, which represents 2 to 5 truckloads. If they spend 75% of their time harvesting, that pays for 25% of their time updating your inventory, pruning adjacent trees, adding habitat trees, planting trees, and fire smarting. In ecoforestry, the 5 to 6 meter space between the trees is wide enough to drive a full-size feller buncher, and you could easily cut this line with a feller buncher, but you can work by hand, hauling with skidders, and process on the road. Now let's watch some movies so we can see how little ecoforestry impacts forest biodiversity, canopy, and biomass. When we come back in 10 years to cut 10 more trees, we head off to a new section of our hectare to minimize canopy disturbance. Notice in the bottom left corner, the first trees we cut 40 years ago have filled out to a 5-meter wide canopy. The canopy disturbance you see in this slide is the maximum it will ever be in ecoforestry, which maintains 300 5-meter trees per hectare forever. In this case, when we got to the creek, we felt the canopy was a little light, so we didn't cut any trees, we planted them. I never cut 2 trees side by side along a watercourse. Same thing here. Keep off the river. Rivers are great places for keeper trees. In this case, we cut 10 trees and planted 12. This is typical in ecoforestry. We're always balancing and optimizing the species range and genetics. Notice the blue keeper trees remain untouched. They are growing nests for marbled murrelets and lichen for deep snow mountain caribou to feed on. We took one tree from the riverbank in this cut, 90 years on, and only one tree cut from the riverbank. At year 100, one more tree removed from the riverbank, but 4 planted. 110 years later, the overall canopy is thicker than it was when we started because we're planting more than we're cutting, and the keeper trees are now reaching up to 7-meter canopy. This increase in canopy and biomass is why ecoforestry sequesters 10 times the carbon that clear-cutting does. Now I'll click through 7 years quickly to emphasize the overall improvement of the land. I haven't run this slideshow out to 200 or 300 years, but you can see that cutting one tree per hectare per year preserves the canopy, which is the foundation of protecting forests. By preserving the canopy and rebuilding a diverse age and species range of trees, we support the same variety and quantity of biodiversity as old-growth forests used to have. By rebuilding the volume of biomass to pre-contact levels, we restore pre-contact levels of the ecosystem services that used to protect us from global warming, fires, and floods. Where clear-cutting is devastating on wildlife, ecoforestry is very gentle because we do all our work in a day with minimal disturbance and don't come back for 10 years. 100% biomass and canopy retention forestry is protection. Your annual inventory will record these verifiable, measurable gains, which will make your community forest socially, economically, and ecologically sustainable. Where an abandoned clear-cut might take 500 years to fully regenerate, ecoforestry is designed to accelerate restoration down to 200 years. We actively use natural deciduous succession where we can and promote deciduous in the understory. In just 100 years, we would have 70% of the original biomass back. In less than 20 years, we would have fire-smarted 1/5 of BC at no cost. 100% biomass and canopy retention forestry is the technical and legislative blueprint for how we can protect 1/5 of BC's land area and stitch up all our fragmented biodiversity habitats. So much argument about fire smarting and protection and flood control and biodiversity habitat and jobs. 1 tree per hectare per year solves all of these problems. But like all paradigm shifts, the most difficult part is dealing with the hardwiring of the human brain for maintaining the status quo. As part of his 30% memorandum, our Premier could enact the new forestry paradigm tomorrow by passing legislation mandating the same 100% biomass and canopy retention forestry that the Menominee and Merv proved for us. But governments don't lead, they follow. To get the legislation, we're going to have to get our community forests to be the change we want to see and demonstrate the benefits. Ecoforestry is not rocket science. It's just as easy to do as clear-cutting. If we can ship a go-kart to Mars and ride it around, we can practice forestry at 1 tree per hectare per year. The Menominee have been quietly doing it since the 1890s. All we need to do is copy them. I've cribbed their tricks for you. The first thing to do is make a business plan involving your community in a discussion of what their goals are and how they want you to achieve them. The North Cowichan Community Forest is nearing the end of this process, and I will use some of their results as an example. For instance, from their 5,000 hectares, they profit $1 million a year, which they use to increase the general tax base of North Cowichan Municipality. What if they approached the community and said, we'll only put in $600,000 over cash, but we'll reinvest the rest to employ 6 local people full-time to protect our watershed and reverse global warming by growing our plantations back to old growth while practicing state-of-the-art fire smarting for our community. But they could be making far more than $1 million a year. To reach our potential, the first step is to stop selling raw logs. The biggest income stream you have is retaining ownership of your wood until wholesale or retail and adding value all along the way. For example, in 1990, I made this $9,000 stereo cabinet from wood I paid less than $200 for, because I bought most of my wood direct from sawmills for $1 a board foot, cut up the way I wanted. I dried it myself and flipped it to customers at $10 a board foot or more. Pity the poor farmer who grew it. and probably gave it away for 10 cents a board foot. Pro tip, don't be that guy. North Cowichan makes $1 million selling raw logs. They can make $3 million off the same wood by getting mills, kilns, and manufacturers to turn their trees into flooring and selling at wholesale. The Menominee took this a step further by owning their own mills and selling direct to the public. Getting an entrepreneur with experience setting up supply chains and income streams involved in your business plan is key. You're moving on from sale contracts based on clear-cutting even-age stands and treating everything that doesn't make it on the truck as waste. In ecoforestry, there is no waste. If you can't sell it, you make it into soil. As we convert our plantations back to old growth, however, we'll find that all the wood coming off the land is not created equal. The spacing stage creates a lot of volume, but of a lower grade wood. Your sort yard should be feeding numerous industries, from fence poles and pulp to firewood. Also, grow your own seedlings from local seed so you can restore the full genetic biodiversity of plant life to your land, including deciduous. Next, because you'll be the only truly sustainable source of forest products in BC, you have a huge edge over the competition and can free yourself from being stuck with corporate market prices. Sustainability has other benefits. North Cowichan believe they can make $1 million a year, as much as they are making clear-cutting, by selling carbon credits. Most carbon credits aren't real, but yours will be, because there's nothing humans need to do more now than grow clear-cuts back into mature forests. And you can sell so much more than just carbon credits. Because you'll be a global leader in ecoforestry, you can sell training modules to universities and colleges and have students pay to come and stay on your land and aid in your restoration. I met a 25-year-old last week who wanted to make a career working in the bush, but he dropped out of forestry in first year because they weren't teaching forestry, they were teaching clear-cutting. There are tens of thousands of young people like him that we need to offer training and meaningful employment future for. The most difficult thing about making the switch to ecoforestry is dealing with the province, but there are several ways to do this. North Cowichan have called the forestry they intend to practice active conservation to release themselves from the constrictions of the standard tenure agreement. The province just gave the Bulkley Valley Centre $10 million to develop innovative forestry projects, and that money is earmarked for the projects. The centre will be advocating for needed changes on behalf of their projects. Converting the tenure from volume-based to land-based is the first step. Accessing the fire smarting and forest protection funds should be easy. The most transformative regulation change would be changing the flat rate upfront stumpage fees into floating rate after-sale royalties. This means you don't need so much capital, you can wait to get a better price, and sell anything because you only pay a percentage of what you sold. So much for fence posts, so much for timber frame beams. This is what makes your sort yard work. All these changes are made easier because the province is highly motivated to look like they're meeting the Premier's 30% memo and initiating the new forestry paradigm. We are putting it on a plate for them. This is the perfect time in human history to get regulatory issues renegotiated. Converting to ecoforestry doesn't need to be all or nothing. You could get a toe in the water by converting half of selected study areas so that we can initiate long-term scientific studies to compare results in partnership with universities or Nature Conservancy Canada, etc. I'm certain I can show you how to make more money, but worst case, you could switch 50% of your land to a 10-year trial and switch back if you didn't like it. You could also start in contentious or high fire risk areas or those identified as crucial biodiversity sanctuaries. Your board should also take a good look at future-proofing your financial health and risk mitigation. In 5 years, the last big trees in BC will be gone. At that point, the people with the biggest and the best trees will be in the strongest position. As you know, trees can't be rushed. The first commercial forests to anticipate this trend and start growing big trees will lead the pack, while the stragglers will struggle. When I started my project to design the legislation and practice of 100% biomass and canopy retention forestry, I was fortunate enough to be able to ask Dr. Simard for guidance. I expected she'd lay some very crunchy science on me, like you'll need 24 mycorrhizal nodes per square meter. Little did I know. She led with what the legislation needs to do is change the relationship between humans and forests from exploitive to protective. Her use of the word protective eventually got me thinking about whether ecoforestry would constitute protection to scientists like the late E.O. Wilson, who spearheaded the 50% land protection theory. I believe my biomass chart proves that it can. After all, indigenous people made fabulous things out of BC forests since time immemorial without harming them in any way. They wrote the book on maintaining a protective relationship with the land. The Menominee have done it with modern technology. What I have hoped to accomplish is to bring her conceptual point into practical everyday terms. A workbook for foresters to practice from, simple legislation to ensure we make the shift as a society. Please let me know what you think of it, and if you're willing to take it on in your community forest.